Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Michelle Moore, to talk about a little-known William Faulkner script. The article you've just published is Vampires, Detectives, and Hawks, a history and analysis of William Faulkner's unpublished screenplay, Dreadful Hollow. Tell us how you came about discovering this and writing about it.
Well, it was actually a very long process. Many years ago, I was writing my dissertation, and I was writing on monsters and violence and modernism. And I had written on a chapter that was half on Willa Cather and half on William Faulkner. And I was finding what I thought were monsters who drank blood, and I wrote at length about this, and I did not want to be the person who wrote about vampires. I just didn't want to do that. I was interested in the Gothic, but not vampires. That was Anne Rice territory.
Right.
And my advisor at the time wrote in the margin, vampires. And I looked at it again, and you don't fight with your advisor, of course,
Right.
and I said, okay, I guess it's vampires. So I rewrote the entire chapter to be about vampires in these modernist writers' work. And then time passed, a few years passed, and I was invited to go down to the Oknapatafa Conference, which is the large William Faulkner conference that's held every year down at the University of Mississippi.
Yeah.
And I read my paper on vampires in Faulkner's novel Absalom, Absalom, and to a lesser extent his novel As I Lay Dying. And when I finished my paper, the top Faulkner scholars who were running the conference immediately rushed me.
Really?
They did. It was one of those.
That doesn't happen often
It
at
really
literary
doesn't.
conferences,
And
does it? Yeah.
and I was so, what is going on? And the first thing that they said to me was, have you heard about Faulkner's vampire screenplay? Well, who's heard about Faulkner's vampire screenplay?
We're introducing it to the world right now,
Exactly.
I think. Yeah.
Well, there's a Faulkner vampire screenplay. Jill Sumner's, his daughter, found it in the closet in Roanoke. You can't make these stories up. It was in 1999. And
It wasn't under some floorboards?
no, close to
Okay.
it. Was in the back of the top of a closet in the entry hall.
All right.
And it would be really great if you could find it. And I said, great, where can I get it? Oh, you can't get it. Well, for me, that was game on, challenge on. Well, it turned out that his daughter, Jill, handed the manuscript right over to Lee Kaplan, who is the executor of the film and video Faulkner estate.
Okay.
And when I contacted Lee Kaplan, he said immediately, got an email right back, it's lovely you're doing this work, but no, you cannot look at the screenplay.
Because there was some directive from Faulkner that this was supposed to remain secret, right? Is that?
Not so much that it's supposed to be secret, but rather Kaplan wanted to make it as a film, he said.
Oh.
So he didn't want it getting it out too much.
Yeah, but somebody he gave a copy to and said, don't share this with anyone, right?
Exactly. That's Bruce Kawen.
Okay, all right. That's the other, there were two copies, right?
Yes, the second copy. And so Bruce Kawen in the 70s wrote the first book on Faulkner and film. Yeah. And he lays out, who Faulkner was in Hollywood. And before that, people just really didn't even consider who Faulkner was in relation to Hollywood. That's just where he went to make money. And so Kawen had the luck of interviewing Howard Hawks at length and asked him about this screenplay called Dreadful Hollow. And at the end of the interview, Hawks gave Bruce Kawen his copy.
Wow.
That was my reaction. And so Kawen promised Hawks that he would keep it secret. That's where the secret comes in, and no one would ever see it. And so when I contacted Bruce Kawen to try to get the screenplay, he said, I am still honoring my secret, or I'm honoring the secret.
Yeah.
2 down, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, well, this is Howard Hawks's copy. We don't usually only have one copy of things, right?
Right.
One script. So I started hunting for where Howard Hawks's papers were.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out they have them out at Brigham Young University in their large archive out there in Utah.
Yeah.
I called them and said, may I have a listing? This is how it was done at this point. May I have the listing of what's in the archive in these particular folders? And I'm wondering if you have the script written by William Faulkner. I was told outright, we have nothing by William Faulkner, but we will tell you what's in this particular folder.
Right.
And when I get the listing, Dreadful Hollow.
Oh, wow.
So I went out there immediately to look at this copy of Dreadful Hollow that's not supposed to exist.
Yeah.
And once out there, the archivists told me that they didn't know they had this thing by Faulkner sitting in the Howard Hawks file. Yeah. And at that point...
So even though they were holding these things, no one had read through all of this to realize that was a Faulkner script.
Right, right. Yeah. Because a lot of what happens in the archive is you hold things and hope someone comes along and tells you what they are. Yeah. A scholar can come along and tell you. And so it's a lot of putting pieces together. And so I knew about this script, as did Kaywin, as did Lee Kaplan, because of the Faulkner side of things. Yeah. But that had not been read into it from the Howard Hawks side of things. Yeah. And so they had at Brigham Young, the Hawks archive, and so they hadn't thought about it through what is this and who wrote this.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting. So, so you got your hands on it. Mm-hmm. And you were under no constraints to not reveal it or anything at that point, right?
I wasn't, but where the constraints came from was in publishing, and as well as what was possible out of the archive. Yeah. So I couldn't take pictures of it. I wasn't allowed to make copies of it with the first rendering of it. Yeah. And there was much debate within the Faulkner world about whether it could even be published in parts, whether I was allowed to quote from it, which is so important, right, when you're giving evidence for arguments.
And that's because they're concerned with protecting his reputation, and he didn't prepare this for the public, and so they feel it would be unfair to put it out, or?
I don't think it was that as much as it was concern over what was fair in terms of copyrights, whether it was a copyright violation. Brigham Young, the archive at Brigham Young was very concerned about this as well. Because while this is Howard Hawks's property and there's no restriction on it, there were certainly restrictions from Lee Kaplan on the Faulkner side. And so how do we negotiate that? Well, as it turned out, the way we negotiate that is we let some time pass. And I was able to finally write a second article after they had determined that it had passed copyright clearance, and they sent me a copy of the script.
Oh, so you didn't have to sneak in with a little camera.
Exactly.
Like James Bond.
Right, and so I was able to write the full article that with my copy of the script, which is sitting in my filing cabinet and is one of my most prized possessions.
Well, I'm sure it is. Let's talk about why this is important. So Faulkner, of course, was already an accomplished novelist, and he went to Hollywood for about 10 years, worked in Hollywood for about 10 years. And there are two major scripts that he mainly authored, To Have and Have Not, and The Big Sleep. And this then would be his third major script, had it been used, right?
Right.
And otherwise he just kind of edited or worked a little bit on some other scripts, but this would be one of his three main Hollywood scripts. So it would be like if you were into his novels, it would be like we discovered an unpublished novel.
Precisely, that's what I think it is, absolutely. And the timing of it is what is so interesting as well, because he had just finished writing the two films you mentioned, as well as doing revisions on them, when Howard Hawks handed him this third novel, this third idea, to then create a screenplay. So this is like the third part of the trilogy that never got completed.
That's interesting. And what do you see? What does it have in common with the other two? Does it look like he's getting more accustomed to writing, to script writing? Do you sense some similar themes? What'd you notice?
Well, he'd been writing scripts for over 10 years at this point, right? But the thing about this trilogy is that Howard Hawks is giving him free rein.
Yeah.
And particularly with Dreadful Hollow, the source material is really resembling what Faulkner had already been written and had been known for. And so, yes, I personally think that this is Faulkner's best screenplay.
Really?
Yes, I do.
Oh my.
And it is a shame that it was never made by Hawks. And the connections are in the changes that Faulkner made to the script, in part thinking about Hawks, but in part also thinking about his own work and what he had just completed with the previous two films. I think one of the biggest changes is that he strengthens the female lead character.
Yeah.
So you can imagine her easily played by someone like Lauren Bacall,
Right.
even though she wasn't up as a possibility for this particular character.
Well, I'm sure Faulkner could easily have had her in mind because she was part of the Howard Hawks entourage, right?
For sure, and
Yeah.
she had just been in the previous films.
Yeah. Now, To Have and Have Not was based on a book by Ernest Hemingway.
Yes.
And The Big Sleep was based on Raymond Chandler's novel. And this was based also on a novel that Faulkner didn't write. So this is Faulkner as someone who is basically revising other people's work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like he put more of himself into this one than he did in the other two?
I feel like he did to some extent.
Because I know he changed it significantly, right?
Yes, he did. The material is still absolutely recognizable as the novel itself.
Yeah.
But as I was mentioning, with strengthening the female lead, the female character, he takes the character of Gillian Dare, who is the young girl from nowhere and no one who gets on a train and takes a job to take care of the older countess. And in doing so, she appears, first of all, very nervous in the novel, very young, very little, very much unsure of herself. Faulkner takes that character and makes her strong, determined, very much like these Lauren Bacall characters in the previous two films.
Yeah.
He also, thinking about Raymond Chandler, and of course the work by Faulkner's good friend Dashiell Hammett,
Right.
he makes the novel more noirish. It is a detective novel of sorts in which the other main character, Dr. Clyde, fashions himself as an amateur detective who must get to the bottom of what is really happening out on the Grange, particularly when Gillian gets there and it all gets really bad really fast. But Faulkner comes in and strengthens that detective character. He had just finished writing 2 detective stories himself. His novels, Light in August and Absalom are detective novels in a different way. He is very much interested in this detective character. But when the time comes now to write his detective vampire film noir, he does so, and he puts script directions in to heighten lighting, to heighten contrast, to make it into the noirish picture that you can really see coming out in his head.
Very interesting. And what was Faulkner's relationship with Howard Hawks? Should we talk about a couple of Hawks films here to kind of let people who aren't familiar with him know what he's done? Other than the ones we just mentioned, he did 1 or 2 John Wayne movies, right? And
there's Rio Bravo,
Rio
right?
Bravo,
Much
yeah.
later
I
with
didn't wanna
Marilyn
name the wrong
Monroe.
one, yeah.
I feel like everyone has seen a Howard Hawks film. The one that comes up again and again, right, is Scarface. That's the one that is thought about most often. That's the gangster film.
Yeah.
And we certainly have gangsters throughout Faulkner as well. So if we look at Howard Hawks' films, we can see that he's interested in strong women characters.
Yeah.
He's interested in detectives. He's interested in gangsters. He's interested in throwing these different types, these different kinds of people together, and then seeing how it comes out in the chaos, which is something that I think Faulkner's doing in his novels as well.
Now, Faulkner's known for his insights into Southern culture. Do we see some of that in this script?
We certainly do. Halfway through the film, when things are really going down as far as it being a vampire film, we see the main female character, who is the vampire, appear and swoop at young Gillian Dare.
Okay.
And when she does so, she appears bat-like, but Faulkner changes this bat-like figure from the original novel's formulation of just simply a bat-like figure to a bat-like figure wearing a white mask. And as soon as he does that, you can see there's Faulkner thinking about what is happening in the American South, and in fact the entire US, insofar as we are thinking about blackness and whiteness, of color, whiteness, what that relationship is. And this swooping figure then is not just a swooping bat-like creature, but is monstrous in the fact that she is now wearing whiteness, wearing a mask to cover up her own monstrosity, something that is at the heart of Faulkner's critique of the American South.
That's interesting. Go into that in a little more detail. Specifically, what's the reference there with the white face?
Well, what you have...
Is that a minstrel show thing?
It can be thought of that way, but it's a kind of reverse minstrel show, which is something that John Duvall at Indiana University pointed out many years ago, that Faulkner's filled with these images of reverse white face minstrel shows, where instead of it being a white figure in a black face, what we have is the whiteness, the mask of whiteness, the robe of the Klan that is white as well, covering up what is really the dark heart, the black heart of racism.
Yeah.
It is once again an indication that the whiteness is covering up the darkness underneath.
Yeah, interesting. You talked about researching modernism in these scripts and in literature of the period. It seems like part of what Faulkner represents is this attempt to sort of capture America before mass media, and to try to, but through his novels and eventually through script writing, to sort of like, preserve some of it, bring it into a contemporary literary scene. And I think of Hopper's paintings along those lines too. Hopper was always painting, theaters and buildings that were in decay that represented another era, and in the 50s that collection of folk music that was recorded, with the early recording devices that of people that were no longer around, of music that was no longer being produced, that got released 50 years later, basically, reminded everybody of this lost world. So as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about Faulkner, tapping into these things that were disappearing everywhere else, and were still very vibrant for him, obviously. Are there other trappings of the past that you see in this?
It is filled with runes, as all good Gothic novels are, right? And Gothic
I guess
films.
definitely a theme of Gothic novels in general, isn't it?
Yes, because the original Gothic novels at the end of the 18th century, the Castle of Otranto, for example, took place in castles, right? We always think about the castle as the site of horror because that's where the original 18th century ones
and
were.
at that point, most of them were in ruins.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of argument against the Enlightenment, right? Where we are moving things forward, where things are progressive, where they're scientific. Whereas the Gothic is interested in what came before, what is crumbling, and what cannot be explained so easily scientifically.
Yeah. What are we overlooking now, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the site for that is going to be the ruins. And your question connects that with the modernist, the early 20th century interest in what comes before as well.
Yeah.
So there is a new element of nostalgia as the world is changing so rapidly through technology.
So modernism itself kind of creates this need and this value for what it's left behind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it makes all the sense in the world that Faulkner is going to be writing in a Gothic tradition about all that came before that is ruined, but then somehow we travel to in his novels, and you live in when you're part of the American South in Mississippi, and you are exposed to, as you become exposed to, say, a vampire, if a vampire happens to live in the castle you moved into.
Yeah.
Bram Stoker's 1899 Dracula is all about this,
Yeah.
because the vampire lives in a very dusty castle, right, in Transylvania. Right. We all generally know the story culturally.
Yeah.
And Jonathan Harker, the young, modern-ish protagonist with his very modern girlfriend, Mina, is sent by his boss, a real estate agent, to go and help the inhabitant of this castle with his move into central London.
Yeah.
And so this novel, which becomes the modern vampire novel, is all about decay, ruin, crumbling castles, that which came before, and what happens when we invite it into not just our home, but our towns, our psyche. And of course, we all know what happens when we invite a vampire in.
Yeah.
They bite us, we become vampires, and we can never get them to leave.
I know, I hate it when that happens.
So these are the things that Faulkner is thinking about with the American South. And in fact, all of modernism, and I think, is to some extent as well, but all in very different ways.
Yeah.
So Faulkner's thinking about what has happened with the slave trade when African Americans have been brought into the US and are now making their home there post-war.
Yeah.
He is also thinking about what it is to be occupying Native American land. And the two writers, Toni Morrison and Louise Erdrich, have in the past several decades been building off of what Faulkner began, at least with regards to method, in order to tell the stories of, in the case of Toni Morrison, what it is to be African American along these lines, and Louise Erdrich, what it is to be of an indigenous population in Minnesota. And both, along with Faulkner, rely heavily on vampiric metaphors in order to tell the tale.
Yeah. So on that note then, does this script then shed any light on Faulkner's other work? Do we learn more about Faulkner from this, and does it help us interpret things in the other direction as well?
I think we do, because what happens then is if we can see that Faulkner took screenwriting seriously, which in itself is a still very debated proposition. There's a lot of thought about,
that he didn't like Hollywood. He was just there for the money.
Exactly,
right, yeah.
exactly, like Fitzgerald, right?
Yeah.
But here, in Dreadful Hollow, we can see, no, he's actually taking this seriously. That he's making astute changes in order to bring this script more in line with the rest of that Faulkner canon.
Yeah.
So if he's doing that, then we need to go back and I've done so, look at his earlier novels, his earlier canon, and say, okay, so where are the vampires here?
Yeah.
And more significantly, where are the vampire films here? Yeah. Because as he was writing Sound and the Fury and then Absalom, Bela Lugosi was on the big screen
Yeah,
as Dracula.
Influencing his ideas of
Very
this.
much so. And
Yeah.
then don't forget White Zombie, which a lot of people do,
Yeah.
because White Zombie is the slave narrative in which the zombies are on a slave plantation down in a southern island, which within the context of this conversation
Yeah.
begins to sound like a Faulkner novel.
And those are the original film zombies. They're not the ones that are running around and chasing people and stuff like today.
No.
Okay, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Michelle Moore for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.